Hello, I'm continuing tonight with the story of the Hotel Riviera by R.K. Lakshman. And I stopped at this point yesterday. I'll read the last sentence I read yesterday. It goes like this. I was glad that the manager had recovered his talkative mood, but after he had narrated the adventures of Reuben in a most lively manner, he appeared to wilt again and lapsed into silence. I hoped he would get up and go away. I had work to do. But he took another cigarette, lit it up, and slid deep into the sofa. That's where we stopped last night. So I'm continuing from there. If my people in the village catch me smoking, they will not let me enter their home. I will be banished, I come from a very orthodox family, he announced and giggled, enjoying the disrespect and defiance he was showing towards his entire orthodox background. What is your father? I inquired. Temple priest. He wanted me also to become one, but I wanted to become an engineer. He refused to educate me beyond high school. I could well imagine the manager's father. One saw old men of that type in the semi-dark sanctum of any temple, thin and shrunken, like a dried chili, with a metallic voice, which was the result of chanting mantras at a high pitch over half a century, nearly all day. The manager told me bit by bit how he had remained at home lazy, doing nothing for many years, how one day the tension between the father and the son had reached a breaking point when the manager decided to run away to his sister's place in the next village. How he had lived with her family for some more years, doing nothing, till his brother-in-law found him the present job. He concluded the story of his life with the remark, "No man can tell what lies ahead of him, can he?" True, very true, I agreed, in harmony with his mood for exchanging platitudes. The life of each creature born is written in the stars, he said, and nobody can read what is written there, I added. Correct, nobody can except God and those few men who are blessed by Him, he said, his face all flushed with this knowledge. I remained quiet, merely nodding my head non-committally. He became more and more trite in his observations, and I found it wearisome to keep up the dialogue. He was saying that our past was beyond our reach, even as our future was beyond our knowledge. What we knew of the present was comparable to a millionth part of one grain of all the sand that abounded in the entire universe. He shivered at the staggering enormousness of it all. I listened in a state of drowsiness induced by the unvarying tone of his voice. Stifled yawns made my jaw muscles ache and my eyes water. He explained his philosophy of life, quoted verses from the Gita, narrated a mythological parable, pointed out the difference between illusion and ultimate reality, and on he went, hypnotized by his own narrative, his words combining to produce one continuous steady drone in my ears as from a wind instrument. I woke up with a start. The manager had stopped talking. He was standing beside me, gently shaking me. "Ah, you must be very tired. You fell asleep." I looked a little foolish. He had fallen asleep. I looked a little foolish. No, I worked late last night, you see. I said, getting up and following him to the door. I'm happy I was able to talk to you. It makes me feel good to unburden myself of all my problems. It is such a joy conversing with an educated man. I murmured something about the pleasure being mutual. But you have not answered my question, sir. Do you or don't you believe in astrology? I must have dozed off when he first put that question. Well, I do now. I do not know, I said. Well, I do not know, I said. You must have some opinion on the matter, surely, he demanded. Then, noticing my helplessness, he added, all right, think it over and we will discuss it another day. I will then tell you something really important. That's the end of that chapter. Now, there is the next chapter. This is chapter 2. At first, small islands of fluffy clouds drifted gently towards the west, unnoticed. Or as days went by, the bluish sky gradually diminished, giving way to the large grey world of shapes riding across the sky. Then the shapes, elephants, cliffs, marching armies, giant flamingos, caricatures of profiles of men, and 1,000 others, melted softly into one another, forming an enormous canopy stretching from horizon to horizon. All air seemed to have escaped from the earth. Heat and humidity clung to the skin like a hot, soggy bath towel and made people scurry towards electric fans and air conditioners. Those in bus queues and in the streets merely took refuge behind dark sunglasses and derived the satisfaction of viewing the landscape of a cooler climate. Men dragged their families along hurriedly to fit them into waterproofs, huts and gumboots. Soon streets were full of people burdened with instruments of defense against the rains. There was a sense of great urgency and expectation in the air. Wiping off perspiration from their glistening foreheads, people looked up at the water-laden clouds above and wondered when the monsoon would break. Discussions and speculations about it, which were animated in the beginning, slowly dwindled to a complaining murmur as each sweltering day succeeded another, more agonizing one. Then came a period of growing concern about water supply, food crops and drought conditions, while the dark clouds continued to loom malevolently over the city. The hope of rainfall receded so far that the people did not bother any more to carry along with them raincoats or umbrellas when they went out. One day I was returning to my hotel in the evening after visiting an electric goods manufacturing concern on the outskirts of the city. I had travelled by bus and a long distance by a crowded local train and was taking a walk from the station to my hotel. I was tired and soaking wet with perspiration, and the thought of a cold shower after reaching my room was the only compensating factor in an otherwise drab, fatiguing day. There were jostling crowds of people returning home from their work, winding queues at bus stops stretched endlessly. Cars, lorries, buses and horse carriages constantly got entangled in traffic jams, and tempers weakened by the infernal weather, the drivers of the vehicles freely abused and shouted at each other. Pavement hawkers were busily accosting passers-by and pestering them to buy buttons, ties, fountain pens and plastic toys. I had almost reached my hotel, but not quite, when the rain drops began to fall, fast and fat and clear. People sensed the oncoming deluge and ran helter-skelter, seeking refuge from the rain. But it was too late. The rain increased in tempo every minute and poured down with hysterical intensity and a great deal of noise. Within minutes, roads were flooded, tram and bus services came to a halt. Everyone was drenched and shivering with a mixture of relief and discomfort. Luckily, I was able to dash into a small restaurant which was next to Riviera. It was very crowded. I could see that the customers were dallying over their cups of tea or coffee or plates of snacks and sticking to their seats, waiting for the rain to stop. I found a place at the far end, quickly moved in and occupied it. All around, the people were watching the downpour outside through the plate glass window as if it was a performance arranged for their benefit. There were loud, happy comments on the rain and laughter everywhere. Everybody seemed to be infected with a festive mood and responding instinctively to the same spirit of abandon as the water cascading down from the heavens. Over the clatter of cups and spoons and saucers and the din of conversation, customers shouted out their orders to the waiters, ate the snacks served to them, sipped their cups of tea in a leisurely way, lit their cigarettes and contemplated the rain with great contentment. I noted that the fat chap at the cash counter was getting worried about his patrons who were sticking to their seats and not making room for new ones. There was a busy train of waiters going in and coming out of a swing door leading to the kitchen. Each time the door swung open and shut, it let in from the kitchen the smell of various appetizing preparations. I was hungry and was looking impatiently around to catch the eye of a waiter when I saw the manager working his way towards me through a maze of people. I had not had a chance to normalize my relations with him after that day when I had fallen helplessly asleep, listening to his monotonous voice. I got up now and greeted him with exaggerated eagerness to make up for my misdeed. "Have you given the order?" he inquired. I said, "I have not." "Good, then come along with me. We cannot sit with this crowd," he said, and led me to a small chamber behind the cashier's counter. It was a neat room with a rather gaudy decor. Its walls were lined with photographs in golden frames of various sizes. The biggest was a huge enlargement of the leader being garlanded by a chubby fat man in dhoti and buttoned up short coat. In the background, a group of persons at a differential distance were craning their necks to be within the range of the camera. I examined the other smaller pictures and they were all on the same theme. The figure of the fat man was constant in all, but the personages he garlanded varied, ranging from the Prime Minister to the governors, mayors, high government officials, presidents of local chambers of commerce, eminent industrialists and movie stars. The manager gave the orders elaborately to a waiter who came in from another door. "Do you like sweets?" he asked, turning to me. "No, not much," I said. "But you must taste the sweets prepared here." "But the sweets are great." He told the waiter to hurry up, sit down and make yourself comfortable. "This room is reserved for special visitors. I always come here. I cannot sit with that crowd outside." "Yes, it's very nice here," I said, and sat down on a sofa which had peacock blue velvet upholstery. "But he's a very good friend of mine. He is like my elder brother. He owns this restaurant. That is my friend. But," he pointed out proudly in the big photograph in which he featured with the Prime Minister, "he had a big hotel in Mysore. Even Panditji visited it and liked it very much. Look at this picture. It was taken then. There is the Minister for Tourism opening Butt's new hotel in Hubli. Butt is a very enterprising, hard-working man. The door opened and the waiter arrived with a tray full of plates loaded with steaming hot snacks. Ah, here they come. I ordered all this specially for you. You will not find these items on the regular menu card, he said, pleased with the flavor and appearance of each dish. I was overwhelmed by his attention and did not know what to say beyond examining. Grand, delicious, wonderful, and joked, you seem to have ordered my lunch, breakfast, and dinner all at the same time. He was very amused by the remark. First taste the sweets, he said. Wonderful, wonderful, I said, after polishing off something with the flavor of almond. It was really good. Then I finished one more variety of sweet, followed it by 2 different types of savory with tongue-scalding chili embellishments. The manager ate with a relish, constantly pressing me to have more. What does BCS stand for? I asked, finding the letters in the form of a monogram on all plates and cups. BCS stands for Butt's Catering Service. He has a flourishing business, catering for wedding receptions, garden parties, even at the race course during the race season and other important occasions. You see Butt garlanding important people in those photographs? Well, they were all taken during such occasions. Remarkable man, I said, obliged to admire the man who was indirectly responsible for the generous repast I had just enjoyed. But is very strict about one thing. His first condition in accepting any contract is that he should be allowed at the end of the function to garland the chief guest as a mark of respect to the dignitary, whatever he happens to be, or whoever he happens to be. I finished my cup of coffee and felt refreshed. A boy came in and cleared up the mess of cups and plates. The manager went out and bought a packet of cigarettes and a couple of pans wrapped in silver foil, thus giving an elegant round off to a session of gluttony. It is still pouring outside, he said, thrusting a pan into his mouth and masticating it with sensual relish. Then he let himself down comfortably onto a sofa and said, now that we have settled down, let us chat. After all, we can't go out in this weather. I adjusted myself in my chair more cosily in agreement with his suggestion. Tell me, do you believe in astrology? Remember, you promised to give it a thought and tell me. Somehow I had felt all along that he would ask about it, but I had not given this subject a thought. Actually, I did not care one way or another about astrology. I had no more interest in it than I had in jugglery. One watched it with interest, that was all. There was no question of believing or not believing in it. But I could not explain all that to him because it was obvious that he was a true believer in astrology. Besides, he had been an excellent host, and I felt at the moment it would be graceless to be honest. I chose to be agreeable. Yes, of course I do, I replied. You are a wise man. I would have also fared better in life if I had some faith in that great science, he said. I was taken aback by this remark. Well, don't you have it? Now, of course I do, but a few months ago I did not. Wisdom comes late to stupid people like me. He tapped his forehead with his palm. If I had better sense, I would have saved my old father so much of strain and unhappiness. Poor man nearly went mad trying to convince me about the value of astrology. Now I realize how wrong I was. After all, My father was such a well-informed man in our ancient philosophy and religion. With a softness in his eyes, he fondly thought of his father. Has he succeeded in convincing you now? I asked. He hasn't. I would not let him either, even if he tried 100 years. You don't know him. He is an angry, obstinate man. If he wanted to tell you in simple thing, say that a crow was black, the way he would put it would immediately make you choose the opposite view, perversely, and argue that it was chalk white. Impossible man. He threw up his hands in despair. How old is he? He must be nearly 70 now. But you will not think so if you saw him. He enjoys good health and is very energetic. You may not believe it. Even today he draws water from the well, tends to our vegetable garden, chops firewood, washes his own clothes. He has no use for a single false tooth still, mind you. Till a few years ago, he chewed bits of cut sugar cane like a schoolboy. He is a great Sanskrit scholar and knows a great deal about our ancient scriptures. He has great qualities, I admit, but his temper, who could stand that? He has not a kind word to say about anyone. He has not a single friend left in this whole village. What about your mother? I asked. Oh, she is a different sort of person. She has no voice in running the house. Her business is to cook and feed him. She never contradicts my father or interferes with him. I am really sorry for her. Even on the day I quarrelled and left home, she merely stood and shed tears without uttering a word. The poor thing did not understand what the hysterics was about between me and my father and why I was leaving. She would not have understood it anyway, even if I had taken the trouble to explain it to her. You see, there were so many issues on which the old man and I used to have a fight daily that my mother was quite confused and never bothered to find out the reason. What I really regret now is that of all the real reasons I had for deserting my home, I left it at the end on a silly, trivial matter. Really? What was it? I asked, becoming curious. Oh, very trivial. As I told you, it's all fate. Nothing is in our hands. A trivial matter? What was it? I butted in hastily, lest he should wander away from the subject. I'm coming to it, he said. You see, there was a lot of tension between us on many matters. First, he wanted to be a priest. First, he wanted me to be a priest. I refused to become one, as you know. I wanted to continue my studies. He would not hear of that. We have a patch of wetland. Well, he wanted me to manage it. I could not. I told him, I said I did not know how to deal with farm hands and cows. And on all these matters, and a score of others, we fought and shouted till our eyes bulged and veins stood out like dry twigs, and showed till our eyes bulged on our faces and necks. Curiously, at no time did it occur to me that I should run away from home. But a small book brought about the end. It was actually by Somerset Maugham, a collection of long, short stories. I borrowed it from the high school library. I was completely absorbed in it one afternoon when my father returned from the temple as usual for his midday meal and rest. The very sight of me lying lazily on the built-in cool cement seat with my legs up on the windowsill must have irritated him. He glanced at me and said that was no way to read a book, even if it was trash. I calmly removed my legs from the window without looking at him and continued to concentrate on the book. He asked me what was the trash I was reading, his temper already rising. I said he would not understand what it was because it was written in English. He lost his temper completely and called me an impertinent good-for-nothing pig. Who wrote the book? Answer, he bellowed. I replied that he would not be able to pronounce the author's name, and so there was no point in telling him that either. At once he pounced on the book like a tiger, tore it from my hand, and ran to the kitchen cursing the author, the book, and me, and everyone. In the kitchen, he pushed my mother aside and thrust the book into the lighted oven. Before I could rush in and rescue the book, Mr. Somerset Maugham was burning brilliantly. For some reason that made me decide I should not remain there for a minute longer, and I left. The manager lit a cigarette and said, "Of course, I wrote to the high school library from my sister's home where I lived at that time and apologized for the loss of the book and offered to pay the penalty. I never received a reply. I don't know if they ever got my letter." He smoked with great concentration and stuffed the butt in the ashtray. I knew the way he sat adjusting himself in his chair that he was preparing to launch a discussion on astrology. I got up to visit the men's room. The rain had settled down to a steady, sonorous torrent. There was nobody in the restaurant now. I wondered how all these people had managed to dodge the rain and escape into their homes. I bathed my face in cold water, combed my hair, and came back refreshed. I myself broached the subject on astrology. We talked in a general way for a while, recounting our expertise with fortune tellers we had run into in public parks, in railway compartments, and pavements of busy streets. Then we discussed palmistry, numerology, crystal gazing, premonitions, and trained birds that pecked at spread out cards with mystic symbols which spelled out one's fortune. I don't believe in any of those methods. I believe all this is invented to provide a livelihood for vagabonds and shady characters, the manager said. I agreed with him wholeheartedly and was encouraged to cite examples of gullible people victimized by crooks masquerading as astrologers. I went on to quote the instance of a man whose entire fortune inherited from his father was lost because an astrologer told him that only by losing every bit of his inherited wealth could he double or triple what he possessed. He threw lavish parties, gambled, speculated in stocks, and did not rest till he had got rid of the last copper in his bank. He was without work for a decade, waiting for fortune to smile on him, living on charity of his friends and relatives. Today, the poor fellow is a clerk in the income tax department. The manager listened attentively to my story and said in a hurt tone, "But I thought you believed in astrology. You said so." It suddenly dawned on me that earlier in the evening I had indeed proclaimed my belief in it, but it had really totally gone out of my mind. Yes, I know. I have no belief in it as it is practiced by thousands of charlatans today. It's a great science and I respect it as such, I explained. He became very excited. "I am so happy you say that. I have the right man for you. The great soul who completely changed my attitude towards astrology and who practices it as a science." So, that is where we'll stop for this session, and I'll mark this spot, so we'll continue from it next time. Thank you and bye-bye. I hope you liked it.